highly anticipated NATO Summit will kick off today in Washington, D.C., bringing together 38 heads of delegation, including President Yoon Suk-yeol. It'll mark President Yoon's third consecutive attendance, highlighting the strengthening ties between South Korea and NATO amid increasing global security challenges. While NATO's expanded partnerships and aid to Ukraine are expected to dominate the summit, considerable attention is also on the message President Yoon will deliver regarding the growing North Korea-Russia arms cooperation and the level of South Korea's contribution in assisting Ukraine's fight against Russia. On this edition of Within the Frame, we preview the summit with a particular focus on South Korea's participation and the implications of an enhanced Korea-NATO partnership. For some insights, Min Jung-hoon, professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, now joins me in the studio. It's always great to have you with us.
My pleasure always.
Also with us tonight is John Nilsson-Wright, head of Center for Geopolitics, Japan and Korea's program at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be back as always.
And Dr. Nilsson-Wright, let's kick things off with you. As I mentioned at the top, this will mark President Yoon's third consecutive attendance at the NATO Summit, which is unprecedented for a South Korean president. Amid signs of the Korean Peninsula emerging as a front line of a new Cold War, according to some, what significance does President Yoon's attendance hold?
Well, I think probably the main thing to stress is that South Korea is signaling very deliberately that its security contribution is global. It's not purely regional. The third time, as you say, attending a NATO summit. The visit today to the US Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu is, I think, another further confirmation of the close ties between the US and Japan. Obviously, the Indo-Pacific Command is important because it provides the critical deterrence capabilities of the United States designed to address the challenge of North Korea. But in terms of the meeting in Washington for the NATO summit, I think it's useful to stress just how many individual countries' leaders President Yoon will be engaging with. We're expecting no fewer than 10 meetings. He will, of course, also meet with the so-called Indo-Pacific Four, a quadrilateral grouping that brings together South Korea, Japan, of course, Australia, and New Zealand, who are all attending this summit. And we've seen also ahead of the meeting some telegraphing of possible cooperation. In September of this year, we may see a NATO ROK cyber defense security initiative. All of this, I think, is designed to send a very clear message that the world is unified in addressing global challenges, and Korea plays a critically important part in that. And of course, we've seen very strong public declarations by the South Korean government, by President Yoon and other officials about the importance of supporting Ukraine in ways that are going to be meaningful and will enhance its security in the face of what has been a very difficult few weeks and months for the Ukrainian government.
And we'll discuss more in detail about South Korea's role as we move on. But before that, Professor Min, as Dr. Nilsson-Wright briefly mentioned, President Yoon is in Hawaii, and he's dropping by Hawaii before he heads to Washington, D.C. for the summit to pay respect to Korean War veterans and also to visit the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. What is the importance of the visit?
Yes, and President Yoon will attend the NATO Summit this Wednesday and Thursday in Washington. And there he will meet with the NATO leaders to discuss the ongoing Ukraine war and the enhancing cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific four countries, IP4 countries. And before the summit, President Yoon is stopping by Hawaii on Monday and Tuesday to pay respect to Korean War veterans and visit the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Specifically, in order to pay respect to the Korean War veterans, President Yoon will visit the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, nicknamed the Punch Bowl, after its dramatic setting like the crater. And it's the final resting place for about 53,000 war veterans and their dependents. And meanwhile, President Yoon will also visit the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is one of 6 geographic combatant commands of the United States, and it covers more of the globe of any of the other commands and shares the borders with all of the other 5 commands. So President Yoon's visit to the Punchbowl National Cemetery will be an opportunity to remember the historic significance of the alliance between South Korea and U.S. and will show the highest respect to the Korean War veterans. In addition, his visit to the Indo-Pacific Command will demonstrate the strong alliance and provide an opportunity to elevate the bilateral cooperation for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific.
Sacrifices made by Korean War veterans, something that we should never, ever forget. And as President Yoon, as South Korea ramps up its security defense cooperation with the U.S., it's also ramping up closer partnership with NATO. NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg has recently stated that South Korea is a highly regarded partner. And he said that the closer that authoritarian actors align, the more important it is for NATO to work closely with its friends in the Indo-Pacific. What does boosted partnership with NATO mean for South Korea?
Well, the enhancing security cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific 4 countries shows that global security environment is changing. Specifically, it is getting more connected to each other. So the main agendas for this upcoming NATO summit includes assistance to Ukraine and NATO's deterrence and defense and the partnerships with the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific countries. And specifically partnerships show that NATO want to work closely with its friends in the Indo-Pacific. And the NATO leaders perceive that NATO could be stronger and safer when it stands with like-minded countries to defend the rules-based international order. And that's why NATO is enhancing cooperation with its Indo-Pacific partners. And as you know, the ongoing Ukraine war clearly shows that Russia is the immediate threat to the NATO member states. And it is known that North Korea is providing ammunition and other military weapons to Russia, and China is silently also helping Russia by providing military supplies and equipment. So along with IP4 countries, the economic support and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, NATO wanted enhance cooperation, security cooperation with the IP4 countries to cope with the increasing security threats posed by Russia, North Korea, and possibly China. Meanwhile, increasing military cooperation between Russia and North Korea also continue to make the security situation on the Korean Peninsula grave. So we can see that partners in Europe and in the Pacific have a security interest in common, and they want to enhance their security cooperation in order to cope with the changing security environment.
And have relations between South Korea and NATO improved, further strengthened since their signing of the ITPP last year, a tailored program to further boost their partnership across 11 areas?
Well, as you mentioned, there is a possibility that the NATO member states and the IP4 countries will be agreed to enhance their cooperation through the existing programs. But we need to see the a little bit subtle differences that the NATO and IP4 countries have in terms of the coping with Russia, North Korea, and China. You know, NATO member states like England and France and Germany, they have a lot of interest in involving in the Indo-Pacific region, but they have a different interest respectively, in terms of getting involved in the Indo-Pacific. For example, France has got the most the military or the security the interest regarding to the Indo-Pacific the region, because it has many the territories around the Indo-Pacific. Meanwhile, England and Germany, they don't have much in the military or the security interest in the Indo-Pacific. And Germany has got the most economic connection with China, so they have a little different threat perceptions in terms of its relations with China. So the NATO countries, NATO member countries, and IP4 countries, they don't have the direct threat perceptions or direct interest in terms of engaging in the traditional security and military operations or the cooperation. Instead, they have some common interest in non-traditional security matters like cybersecurity and the sharing information and like the emerging technology cooperation or something like that. So I think that at the upcoming summit, they will talk about those issues and mainly, and possibly they will have some agreed statement after the summit.
And Dr. Nilsson Wright, aid to Ukraine will likely top the agenda, and NATO is expected to endorse a new initiative for Ukraine during this week's summit in Washington, dubbed the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine. Well, not everyone seems to be satisfied with the new effort. What are your prospects?
Well, I mean, perhaps one of the most important things to stress is the political dimension here, where we have, of course, a weakened American president because of all of the concerns about President Biden's health. It will be very important at this NATO summit for the United States to demonstrate that it can provide the sort of leadership that NATO is looking for. A large concern, of course, about the NATO gathering is putting in place institutional mechanisms for cooperation and support for Ukraine that will, if you like, future-proof the NATO initiative against the possibility of a Trump victory in November. On the back of the recent election in France in the National Assembly, there will, I think, be a great sense of relief that the far right, Marine Le Pen's party, was not as successful as people expected, because that would have raised questions about the sustainability of French commitment to the NATO effort in Ukraine and French support for Vladimir Zelensky. And of course, we've just had a government elected in Britain. John Healey, our new defense secretary, has visited Kyiv, has met President Zelensky. And so there are efforts undergoing by a number of countries to reinforce their commitment. The nature of the NATO new security initiative is designed, I think, not only to enhance cooperation amongst the 32 NATO members, but to reach out to partners in the Indo-Pacific, particularly South Korea, to strengthen additional forms of assistance and cooperation. But one of the things that I think is very striking and which will be announced is the establishment of a NATO military headquarters in Wiesbaden in Germany that will provide training for some 700 personnel or so to support Ukraine's efforts. And there is some speculation that we may see a decision by the United States to deploy military advisors to provide further technical assistance to the Ukraine on the ground. That raises interesting questions about the, if you like, the mission creep, the possibility that the United States will become more firmly embedded in the war in Ukraine. And as we saw with those very distressing photographs just yesterday of the Russian attack on a Ukrainian hospital in Kyiv, there are, I think, increasing pressures on NATO and other NATO members to do more to support Ukraine in this very difficult time. The possibility that that will expand is raising, I think, concerns in some quarters about the risk of escalation and expansion of the military conflict. So this will be a very delicate balance. It will require cooperation between NATO members and non-NATO members. And I think President Yoon will want to demonstrate his appreciation of the gravity of the situation. And as your previous speaker was indicating, think about the broader range of non-traditional forms of security cooperation. Support, for example, for expansion of arms exports to other countries, not to Ukraine specifically, but other countries who can then in turn provide their own indigenous support for the efforts of the Ukrainian military to resist Russia's aggression.
Stoltenberg has recently highlighted the legality of South Korea's weapons aid to Ukraine, pointing out that it should not be equated with North Korea's suspected munitions delivery to Russia, as Russia's invasion is illegal. Do you anticipate detailed discussions between Stoltenberg and President Yoon regarding Seoul's weapons aid to Ukraine?
Well, Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-hyo has been very clear in telegraphing before the President's visit that there will be substantial discussions. And there's no doubt that the public statements by Jens Stoltenberg have emphasized that Korea undoubtedly has a role to play. Stoltenberg has made it clear that Korea is seen as a global actor, and it's quite legitimate for it to be involved in these active discussions. But I think for reasons that are I think, quite sensible, the South Korean government is going to limit its assistance to Ukraine directly in the form of humanitarian assistance and not direct military support. Having said that, of course, the government of South Korea is very alive to the increased military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. President Yoon has made it very clear that South Korea's support for Ukraine will be in part influenced by the extent to which Russia and North Korea increase their own cooperation. And just today, there's news reports from Seoul highlighting the dispatch of a high-level military delegation from North Korea to Russia. The worry, of course, is that this presages and anticipates perhaps closer military-to-military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang. I don't think we're yet there in terms of concrete military assistance, but there is talk of training. There is talk of possible North Korean workers being involved in providing construction support for the Russian effort in the Donbass, for example. And President Yoon is trying to signal, I think unambiguously, that Russia and North Korea have to be careful about the full extent of their partnership, because it may then militate a stronger response from South Korea. But for now, the response in terms of NATO ROK collaboration is going to be in these broader areas, including humanitarian assistance and broader technical cooperation.
And in related question, Professor Min, South Korea has made quite bold remarks after North Korea and Russia signed a new military pact. It said that the pact lifts all restrictions of South Korea's aid to Ukraine, hinting at the possibility that provision of lethal weapons to Ukraine could also be on the table. Now, Dr. Nielsen Wright has mentioned that that will be very unlikely, and South Korea's aid to Ukraine will likely remain limited to humanitarian assistance. How do you gauge the chances of South Korea actually providing lethal weapons to Ukraine?
Yes, and personally, I also agree that the South Korea will not provide the lethal weapons to Ukraine. And what Seoul mentions such a possibility is just a diplomatic warning against Russia that it should not cross the red line in terms of its relationship with South Korea. And it is known that North Korea is receiving energy, food, and other economic support from Russia in return for providing ammunition and military weapons to Russia. And it is also suspected, but not confirmed, that Russia is providing North Korea with one-point lessons for the advanced military technologies like the military spy satellites. And signing the new military pact between North Korea and Russia means that they will definitely increase their military cooperation. So it could pose a greater security threat to South Korea, and therefore South Korea had to send a strong signal to Russia that it is going too far. Meanwhile, it is reported that South Korea could increase its military support for Ukraine at the upcoming summit, like providing military electronic warfare equipment and surveillance drones to Ukraine, and offering such non-lethal military equipment and supplies could be uncomfortable. But would be acceptable by Russia because South Korea does not cross the red line in terms of its relations with Russia. And that it would also contribute to enhancing South Korea's international standing as a global pivotal state, that it takes more responsibility for the global security and stability.
This marks President Yoon's first multilateral summit since North Korea and Russia signed a new defense treaty. What message would he send out to the Western alliance and the world?
Again, increasing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia poses a greater security concern to South Korea, and it also gives the security concern to NATO member states because North Korea's military weapons are being used in Ukraine. So it is likely that President Yoon will share the information about the military cooperation between North Korea and Russia with the NATO leaders, and they will together strongly blame such illegal military cooperation. And at this point, it's not clear what measures they will agree to take, but there is a possibility that they will impose further sanctions against North Korea and Russia. And they could also agree to enhance their security cooperation, like sharing military confidential information, cybersecurity, and countering disinformation and defense industrial cooperation. So we will see what agreements they will actually reach at the upcoming summit.
And Dr. Nilsson Wright, countering China's growing influence in the region will also be discussed. And on that note, along with President Yoon, leaders of Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, NATO's key Indo-Pacific partners have also been invited. What is South Korea's role in helping like-minded nations keep China in check?
Well, China, of course, is part of the bigger strategic challenge that all countries in the Indo-Pacific are grappling with. We've seen South Korean forces participating in the so-called RIMPAC, the Rim of the Pacific exercises, which have started and will last until August of this year. This is, I think, an important opportunity for enhanced military-to-military coordination, joint exercises, and at a smaller level, but equally important, both practically and symbolically rather, trilateral cooperation between South Korea, Japan, and the United States. That's very much a response, of course, to the direct challenge of the DPRK, but it also provides real opportunities for improved coordination between the militaries of the three countries. And that builds, of course, on the hugely important Camp David agreement from last year. Much of the work, I think, by the South Korean government to address those reflected, for example, in the possibility of South Korea maybe becoming a participant in Pillar 2 of the AUKUS initiative. This is still something that is yet to be agreed. And we've seen, of course, also discussions about defense military technology cooperation. The Ministry of Defense, the South Korean Ministry of Defense, will be holding a conference this week in Canberra, which will talk about military-to-military cooperation between South Korean defense industrial contractors and their Australian counterparts. Vice Minister of Defense will himself travel to Australia to engage in those discussions. There are many areas short of formal direct military relationships where there is room for both technical, strategic, and economic mutual benefits for Australia and for South Korea. And that's true of other relationships. We might expect also a greater appetite for the sharing of intelligence, again, to address the threat of the DPRK, but also it has a knock-on effect in terms of addressing the wider challenge of China. However, of course, notwithstanding the real military concerns about China's expansion in the East and South China Seas, South Korea, of course, has a very important economic relationship with China. We saw that reinforced in the recent trilateral summit in Seoul between the Japanese, Chinese, and South Korean leaders. And on the back of that came a commitment by both Seoul and Beijing to explore the possibility of establishing a 2+2 defense and foreign ministry level dialogue between China and the ROK. So the South Korean position will be to both guard against long-term strategic challenges, but also maintain the importance of cooperation and dialogue with China. That's important, not only, of course, because of the economic relationship, but because of long-standing political and diplomatic ties between Beijing and Seoul. And in this context, of course, China is important because it provides an opportunity to exert influence on the DPRK. So in other words, as the challenge from North Korea becomes more acute because of that closer cooperation between Russia and North Korea, South Korea will be looking to try and persuade the Chinese to exert their own influence on Pyongyang in an effort to restrain the North Korean leadership and to mitigate against the risk of enhanced security tension between the two Koreas.
Well, it looks like South Korea will need a very smart, pragmatic, and solid strategies to boost ties with the Western alliance, with NATO, while maintaining cordial relations with its important Asian neighbor, China. And that is where we'll conclude our discussion today. Thank you so much, Dr. Nielsen Wright, as always, for sharing your insights. And many thanks to you as well, Professor Min, for your thorough analysis.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.